Hello there, beautiful friends. I am Blackenfist, and this is actually a response. It's a response to a podcast of Vegito EX, a podcast I really enjoy, the Kanzenshuu podcast. And the topic he had on really intrigued me, and it was the debate about power scaling and whether it was productive to talk about this and whether it really distracted or it hurt the fandom as a whole. The topic was fascinating to me, and it caused a lot of thoughts within my head. And at the end, he seemed like he almost wanted someone to explain to him maybe what compels people to even talk about these subjects in the first place. So, considering the fact that I had so many thoughts in my head and it provoked a lot of things within me, I felt maybe making a video like this would be productive. Before I begin, however, I must say that I don't consider myself to be someone who to be invested in the power scaling and power level debates. Now, of course, I have engaged in these topics and these conversations in the past. That's without a doubt. I made like 3 videos. Out of all the videos I made 3 videos specifically on, who two characters against each other hypothetically that never happened in the series. So I have engaged in these topics, but my point of view has always been, well, for someone who talks about Dragon Ball as much as I do and who's engaged in just a bunch of conversations about Dragon Ball, and because I like this series so much, my point of view has always been, well, if you're engaged as much as I am, you're going to run into these conversations eventually, and I will engage with them if they interest me. Now, I understand that not everyone in Dragon Ball is in the fandom is like that. I understand that some people don't find that interesting, which I understand. I'm a party that isn't exactly invested in these conversations 100%. I'm not super duper intrigued by this, but I'm not apprehensive to engage with them as well. So I just wanted to put that disclosure out there because I don't want to come off as someone who is just really into power scaling and power levels. And I just felt, I don't know, because I know people are going to say, or some people are going to say it in the comments, that I felt offended at Vegito EX's podcast, which I didn't. I found it extremely intriguing, but I do feel that there's some views that I just wanted to get across in this. And one of those first things is when he said that, which is true, that fans, of course, take the power leveling and power scaling debates to new heights, to heights that even the characters themselves don't bring up. Now, of course, he did bring up examples when the characters themselves did explore this aspect, like, for instance, when Goku and Vegeta were exploring the Super Saiyan grade levels. So there was those instances in the series where characters did get into the nitty-gritty, but the fans definitely take it farther than the characters did, and that is certainly true. But my response is really, well, the fans, not just in Dragon Ball, but in any fandom, and I think this is just a mark of a fan, they'll take it further than the characters or what's presented on the surface of that series in any subject. To me, it just seems a little weak to say that, well, the characters didn't go too far into it, so the fans shouldn't. That's what is implied, at least. And I feel that, well, just think about how many of the topics would be limiting if you could only talk about what the characters themselves are interested in or what they brought up themselves. I feel there were so many Dragon Ball conversations. Of course, all of the out-of-world stuff would be completely left out because the characters obviously don't mention that kind of stuff. But then there's a bunch of conversations just about the god hierarchies that are only mentioned seldomly that fans like to get into and to discuss the nitty-gritty of it. And I think power scaling and power levels are just one aspect of that. Saying that the characters themselves don't engage in these conversations as deeply as the fans do, well, that might be true. It might, but it is also at the same time a very limiting thing to say that, because just imagine how many topics would be off limits if we were just going to go by the criteria of just we're going to discuss what the actual characters in the series were interested in. Another subject that I found intriguing was when the fact was brought up that of course strength is a big aspect of the series, but it's not like the focus. It's only in service to the plot, as Vegito EX put it, which is very much true. Strength, I feel sometimes fans could get misguided, or they could indulge themselves a little bit too much on these strength debates, and maybe miss something a higher like the bigger picture, or miss another aspect of the series when you overly focus on strength, which is very much true, that strength is in service to the story and the character development. But I just want to say to all the people, not just Vegito EX, to all the people that don't understand exactly why people get so into strength debates and everything, you just have to examine how Dragon Ball is structured, just the way it's structured itself. It is structured around characters being strong. Now, I know that's a very obvious statement, and I think obviously most of you know that. You could call this a weakness of Dragon Ball, but a lot of times the characters and the plot, they are chosen because of certain characters' capabilities. And because Dragon Ball is structured around fighting a lot and fighting powerful opponents, the capabilities oftentimes means strength. A very easy way to explain this is to just give an example. For instance, a lot of people complain and hark on the fact that many characters get left behind. Prominent examples are Kuden, Tien Shinhan, Yamcha, pretty much all non-Saiyan characters. So why is that? Why is it the fact that these characters got left behind? And there could be a whole host of reasons. But what is the most obvious reason? Well, because Dragon Ball revolves around fighting powerful opponents, what that means is strength. These characters were not strong enough to continue on in the plots and for them to be as prominent as they used to be. And you could say that's a major flaw that Dragon Ball has. Now, of course, I'm not saying that every character that's not strong enough goes into retirement. Obviously, Kuden had some development even after he was too weak to compete, you could say, but a character like Tien Shinhan was pretty much written out of the entire story, and I feel one of the reasons is because he was just not able to compete with the conflicts that Toriyama was writing out. He kind of got written out of the plot, and I feel also that other characters kind of replaced his role in the grander scheme of the story, but that's another point entirely. What I'm trying to say is character development and story, that is all very important, but it's also very tied to a character's strength in the series, because that's just the way Dragon Ball is structured. Some of the greatest development Gohan ever had was in the Cell arc, and what was one of the major things in there? Gohan became strong enough for him to be relevant in the plot. Of course, all that character development is crucial, and there are multiple aspects to this, but one aspect to that is the fact that Gohan did become stronger, and therefore his character was able to be developed a little bit more. I know that's a very broad generalization, and there are definitely characters that don't fit in that mold. Bulma comes to mind. She has been prominent kind of pretty much throughout the entire series, although not being very strong, although she's never at the forefront of a storyline or conflict, because obviously Dragon Ball is just the way, that's just the way it's structured, and that's the way her character is. Obviously, she didn't lose relevance, and I understand that there are those characters out there like Kuden, but then there are also characters like Tien Shinhan. There are characters like Kami Sennin, who Kami Sennin used to be a lot more prominent in earlier Dragon Ball. He never truly was erased or expunged, although I do feel like in much later Dragon Ball he really was like a background character, but his prominence was very much reduced. There's a lot of reasons. It's not just for one reason, but one of those reasons is definitely strength. It is definitely because Kami Sennin was just not able to deal with those conflicts. I mean, do we not remember that in the Piccolo Daimao arc, he directly confronted a main villain, and that was actually something that he could feasibly see himself doing. Could we really feasibly see himself confronting someone like Frieza or Cell? Not really. It wouldn't provide, his character really wouldn't provide the same weight that it would back in the Piccolo Daimao arc, and that's exactly what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that character development is definitely important, but in Dragon Ball, sometimes the characters that get developed are the characters that can deal with the conflict. And the characters that can deal with the conflict are the stronger ones that obviously they're the ones that can deal with that. So, and perhaps that is a weakness on Dragon Ball's part, that it overly relies on strength, which, come to think of it, I was going to do a video on the biggest problems, the biggest flaws that Dragon Ball had, and I still might do. I'm still going to probably do this video. I'm a big Dragon Ball fan, but I'm not afraid to criticize it because, you know, that's how much I like this series, and I'm just very comfortable in my fandom. And one of the biggest flaws I think that Dragon Ball has, that it does, to me, it overly relies on strength. And what I really mean by that is just think about how little times a weaker guy in Dragon Ball defeats a stronger guy. How little does that really happen? How often is it that the fight, the conflict ends, the fight is concluded because simply one guy is stronger than the other guy? That's how it ends. That's how most, I'm not saying all, obviously when Raditz came down to Earth, Goku and Piccolo were individually much weaker than him, but they both strategized at tactics and everything and got Raditz into a vulnerable position to get him, you know, to obviously go through that conflict. And obviously there are those examples, but overwhelmingly Dragon Ball does rely on one guy becoming stronger than another guy, and I feel that is a flaw that Dragon Ball has. But you also have to think about it in terms of who's attracted to something like that. If the series itself puts such a premium on strength, if it just puts so much emphasis on this one thing, would it be so surprising that the fans themselves would also put a lot of emphasis on it? And that's really my main point. If a series is putting emphasis on this one thing, obviously it's going to attract people that are intrigued or are lured to this thing, and that one thing is strength. Obviously Dragon Ball is not just strength, and I know for a fact that I've fought against this notion because I like to think of Dragon Ball as something much more than it's commonly perceived. So I'm not trying to steer the direction of Dragon Ball down a gutter. That's not what I'm trying to do, obviously. But I do acknowledge, or at least I feel from my perspective, that strength is definitely a huge part of it. And it's going to attract certain people like that, and that's inevitable, I think, for a series that is structured like Dragon Ball. And one final thing that I would want to say is that, and this really applies to not just Dragon Ball, but any fandom really, the nature of fans, whether it be a fantasy fan, someone who's into science fiction, anyone who's into a fictional world. One thing that we love about fictional worlds, and one thing that fans love to do and love to indulge in, is consistency within that world. Things that are connected, that make sense. And I think that this really comes from the fact that our world, you know, the real world, the world we live in, is very consistent. So we like to see that reflected in our fictional worlds, and whatever it may be. And like I said before, this applies to a lot of fandoms. Fans that logically connect dots that are only implicitly implied in the series, but you know, if you're a fan, if you really love the series, you're going to dig through it, and you know, you're going to find those connections, and you're going to make those logical connections that maybe someone who isn't as into the series would notice. And that's just something that is in a lot of fandoms. That's not just in Dragon Ball. But when we apply this thing to Dragon Ball, obviously we could go down, in terms of consistency, we could go down many roads. We could go down the consistency of the God hierarchy, how the world is, how the afterlife is in Dragon Ball, and all the consistency there. Obviously, I think Dragon Ball is not the most consistent of worlds, which, I mean, I accept. That's just the nature of it. But I think every Dragon Ball fan, in some level and in some form and way, likes to examine the world of Dragon Ball and maybe appreciates the consistency, but whether it's between characters, whether it's between certain aspects of the world, which I love the Dragon Ball world, and I like indulging in trying to see all the intricacies of how the Dragon Ball world is. But one thing that Dragon Ball has as a theme running throughout, obviously, is the idea of fighting strong opponents. That's just something that throughout most of Dragon Ball that has been the case. I feel that it's going to only be natural for some fans to try to draw a consistent line through all of that Dragon Ball history And how does that manifest? It manifests itself in strength debates. It manifests itself, could this guy beat the other guy? I think it's just an inevitable question. Or at the very least, I feel it as it's going to be an inevitable question. I'm not trying to argue that you should like these debates, you should like power scaling, that you're not a real fan if you're not into this aspect of the series, because obviously that is not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say why some people might be interested in these debates. And although, like I said before in the beginning, I don't really consider myself to be extremely invested in this, I definitely can understand someone who might be like a little bit more invested, a little bit more interested than maybe the average fan. But even if you're someone who is not interested at all in this type of these debates or this topic whatsoever, that's fine too. To me, what I found is that Dragon Ball fans are extremely different from one another, honestly, and that's honestly for many different reasons. What attracts them to Dragon Ball could be very different things, and I think that's one of the great things about Dragon Ball, is because there are so many things that you could attach yourself to Dragon Ball. There's so many things to like about it that I think it'll inevitably attract different types of people. And I think that's what you're seeing with Dragon Ball, and why it has the people that it has in it. So obviously, not everyone's going to agree on everything, and that's fine. But I also want to say that there is a point where obsessing over power levels and power scaling does ruin maybe the enjoyment that someone could have for Dragon Ball. And that is absolutely true, that just because strength is a part of the series doesn't mean you should overly obsess about it. Or if you do, I feel just keep that to yourself. But that's just my philosophy. Obviously, I do think that you could take things too far. So what I'm not saying in this video is that just go free reign go full force, 100%, pull all your eggs in that basket of power scaling. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that I think could be a healthy balance. I will admit, it is definitely one of the bigger things in Dragon Ball that people obsess over, and I think the reason it's one of the bigger things that people obsess over is because of the reasons I stated in this video. But I feel that obsessing over other things in Dragon Ball could kind of detract from a fuller understanding of what Dragon Ball really is. And so really, that's my whole response. Hopefully, maybe you did get a window into how maybe fans that enjoy these debates, because you did say that you just cannot understand it. Maybe I could give you a window into that, and to other people that might not understand it. I'm not saying for you to like it. My philosophy is I can't force someone to like something, but if I can maybe help you understand it, then perhaps that's good. Or maybe I didn't. Even if that's the case, then I mean, I tried my best. For the most part, I really didn't disagree with a lot of what Vegito EX said, although I do disagree on one thing. I disagreed a little bit strongly on, and that one thing was when he said that power scaling debates are the most toxic thing in the Dragon Ball fandom. And I don't know, maybe that is true, but from my experience, I think that there's definitely one area of realm within the Dragon Ball fandom that is definitely the most vile, and you could say toxic, and that's really debates about different versions of the show, whether that be dub or sub, Kai versus Z, Funimation versus Ocean voice casts. Pretty much debates over different versions of the show have really turned, I feel, are a little bit uglier, because at the very least, I feel, as ugly as power scaling debates can get, at the very least they're passionate about the show, and in those debates they're disparaging someone else's opinions. That's I think that's the worst I've seen. The worst it gets in debates about different versions of the show. Not only are they disparaging someone else's opinion, they're disparaging whole cloths of people pretty much within the fandom. So anyway, that's just what my opinion was on that. But anyway, if you really watch this video through and through, I really recommend you just listen to that podcast, and why not just follow the Kanzenshuu podcast. It's a great podcast if you're a Dragon Ball fan, and you get some really interesting conversations on there. So those will be in the description. You should really just follow the Kanzenshuu podcast and go on Kanzenshuu. There's a bunch of information on there. A lot of the information I get for my videos, I get through there. So it's definitely a great website to go to, and it's definitely a great resource. But anyway, guys, I hope that you found this not too rambly and you found it interesting. But anyway, guys, I'm Blackenfist, and I'm out, man.